In order to set the tone for this amazing document tonight, I want to try an experiment by looking at modern science. Paul tells us something quite unique. He says, if you look at the world around you, the things that God made, you will have insight into the character of God. And if that's true, then modern science, more than any other period in history, helps us define God. What do we know from the astrophysicists in theory? What do we know from what we've seen captured in video, what we've seen by pictures that go back hundreds of thousands of years? We see a very sedate, organized system. Apart from objects that are projected into space, they're really quite far from each other. There's this new mapping of our solar system. If you haven't seen it, I do urge you to go online and mapping the solar system. And they take you through the entire time of the expansion of our solar system through the planets and how far apart the planets really are. Super, super far apart compared to what we assume. Because we see them reflected in telescopes as they move. They're the only things that move. So you can spot them, but you can't always tell what they are. And except that we know that they're planets. When you start looking at the technology they're using now, where they're shooting back almost to the Big Bang and trying to make sense of what caused that electrical storm, etc., you do get some impressions about God that previously were missing. Like, God clearly is a relational being. The universe is terribly relational. Everything is about relationship. Anything out of its place, anything that is collapsing, anything that is burning up, anything that is shooting, still belongs to a system that's basically well organized. And therefore, when you look at science, you know one thing for sure, and that is the organization of the universe is like the organization of God, that the relationship that the universe has with all of its bits is the same kind of relationship we have with God. God's a relational being. This is the kind of argument that Athenagoras makes, except the sciences 2,000 years ago. And it's brilliant. He doesn't overstep his boundaries. He's not a scientist, but he is a philosopher. And it's this kind of philosophy that got me interested in this field and why I pursued a degree in it. I wanted to spend my time reading things that would make sense of the world around and also what would make sense about God. And the one thing we can say unequivocally is that God exists based upon what we see. You see the universe, you see God. I was in a debate just about 4 or 5 weeks ago. A small debate. It was just about 50. And they all wanted to deny the existence of God. And I wanted to extol the virtues of the contrary. And they kept evading the main question, which is, you tell me that something cannot come from nothing. But you can't tell me where that nothing comes from. You can't tell me where that something comes from. You can tell me that things expand, but you can't tell me why they expand. You can tell me that the universe exists, but you can't tell me why the Big Bang is going to now once again reduce and then re-blow up again, so nothing comes from nothing, and yet there's something there. You can't explain why something other than nothing. And this is the debate we have over and over again between theology and religion, but it doesn't need to be a debate. This is just looking at Paul, one individual deciding that if you look at the universe, you can see the nature of God, the splendor, the spectacular. And this is without city lights, so you can look up at night and actually see just how vast the solar system is. All that to say, Athenagoras does this in a brilliant way. He uses the modern science of his day, combines it with theology, and develops a philosophical religious view. And I'm really fond of this, and I want to share it with you because it's an unheard byline. He's a Christian who converted late in life and therefore hasn't shed any of his philosophical gleanings. In the midst of it, the Epicureans are at the center of debate between the Stoics and Epicureans at this time. You find some of the smartest people in those fields were living at this very time. Marcus Aurelius, to whom this document was written, was a well-known Stoic philosopher who developed. In fact, he's called the philosopher king when he becomes appointed king or emperor. Those ideas that he had as a kid, that morality, he took right from nature. He saw the way nature operated and functioned accordingly. He was a God-believing individual, but not the Christian God. If Christians had just dropped the resurrection of the dead, he probably could have bought into Christianity, but that's the crux of the faith. So he mentions the Epicureans as his main enemies. So I went to Lactantius, which is a Latin writer in the last part of the third century, a Christian who became advisor to Constantine, and he also was a philosopher prior to his conversion. And he summarized this conundrum, and I thought it was the best summary that I had in my library. God either wants to eliminate evil but can not, or can eliminate it but does not want to. Or he wishes neither to eliminate it nor is able to do so. Or he both wants to eliminate evil and is able to do so. If he wants to eliminate evil and is able to do so, then he is weak. If he cannot eliminate evil and is able, if he cannot, if it cannot, then he's not applied to God. If he can eliminate evil but does not want to, then he's just spiteful. But this is equal to a foreign nature of God, not the way that you would normally think of a God. If he neither wants to eliminate evil nor is able to do so, then he's both weak and spiteful, and therefore is not a God. If he wants to eliminate evil and is unable to do so, then he's not a proper God by any standard, and he can't eliminate evil. And these things go on and on and on. The conundrums go on and on and on in between the Epicureans and the Stoics, trying to understand who God is, if there is a singular God. It isn't monotheism that bothers the Greeks. It's the fact that you are distancing your behavior from the standard of the day. You can have a singular God. Aristotle maintained a prime force, prime mover. Plato maintained, for the most part, a singular God. Socrates certainly did. So it's not like there's not a camp of this. It's the Epicureans wanted to show that God may exist, but God's unknowable, and therefore trying to pursue God and his character is pointless. The document I want to talk about this evening is called A Plea on Behalf of the Christians. It was composed as if intended to be spoken out loud. And what is said about Athenagoras is he wrote lots of speeches for others to read on his behalf. So it's not surprising that we have his main apology, his main document of defense, written in this form. It's rhetorical in style. In fact, the best rhetoric you'll find in any early Christian literature. I think I could say, without fear of contradiction later in my life, that this is the best document Christians wrote during the first 300 years of the church. When it comes to downright style, rhetoric, insight, the philosophy, it's difficult to translate, which is why the document came out late this week. Difficult to translate, difficult to traverse when it comes to seeing his argument overall. It's not verbose like Justin, but it's wordy, because he has all these secondary applications he wants to make sure he drags into the primary argument, which we'll share in a little bit. But rhetorical style in general, and the oration that flows and the rhythm of his sequence is unlike anything else in early Christianity. No one else does this, because he's a real philosopher. Never gives up his garment, always walks around as a philosopher, even after a Christian. His purpose was to address three popular charges against believers: atheism, cannibalism, and sexual deviancy. These are three things Christians want to clear up. The first accusation was the result of believers worshiping a singular God. Athenagoras was the earliest patristic writer to offer proof for monotheism, and he did so based on reason and scientific evidence. It's fascinating. The argument it's encapsulated in a paragraph in this document. But his argument is pure, it's intentional, it's deliberate. He's not leaving anything out, but it's a pretty convincing argument if you're a philosopher. The second rumor was regarded absurd because believers were more humane than the pagans and condemned both abortion and infanticide, and even the gladiatorial games were denounced as forms of murder. Again, abortion comes up. It comes up in all these apologists. because abortion was rampant in the ancient world. In fact, in Greece especially, there was the exposing of children till they die, the killing of children, the drowning of children, the sending of children off to the farms if you didn't want them, all kinds of misdeeds, as Athenagoras sees, based on his own culture. If you're not killing that which is in the womb, you're almost antisocial. Athenians know this. Alexandrians know this. I told you about the fragment that was found from a man named Hilarion, who wrote to his wife and says, it's going to be a little longer in business here. I'll be back after the baby is born. If it is a girl, kill it. If it is a boy, keep it. That's rough. That's the culture in which this comes, from which this comes. So the second one certainly is a good standard. You call us immoral, and you claim that, you know, we're cannibals. How can we be cannibals when we don't even kill our own babies? He also maintained that Christian virtue prevented the faithful from harming others and from practicing any kind of vice. Why is this? He makes it real clear multiple times in this document that once you become a believer and are baptized, you never sin again. Same thing we found in Aristides, same thing we found in Justin, same thing we found in Diognetus. All of these apologists conclude the same. And it's unfortunate that we've lost that kind of thinking in our modern world, that sin isn't a list of do's and don'ts. Sin is a violation of what James calls the royal law, loving your neighbor as you love yourself. And how many ways would you do that? I can think of dozens of ways I violate that every week. I mean, I pass the poor people on the streets and I don't help them. I see people on the street corners holding up signs and I don't help them. Now, I'm not saying that that's the direct approach, but I also don't go to churches and see what kind of money they need. I don't go to organizations. I try to take care of things on my own, and I'm barely surviving. Would it mean that I'm wrong? Well, is my conscience clean? Throughout the early church, the one standard was, can you afford giving money away? Can you afford it? If you're going to be in full-time ministry, you better afford it, because your life is no longer going to be around a house. You have no place to retire. You'll be in ministry till you die. Hence, Barnabas, who was extremely wealthy, sold all of his property, gave it to the apostles, and went in full-time ministry. Now, this isn't for everybody, because you have to be meeting in people's homes, and people with families would certainly still retain their homes. But you get to Tertullian, let's say 150 years later, and he says, we have more than we need. Everybody gives without compulsion, and all the community is grateful for the unity that this has brought them. Everybody contributed what he was able. That's the phrase you find in every one of these writers of the early church. We gave without compulsion. It went to the place we wanted it to go. And when we covered Justin, you saw this, because in Justin actually tells you where all the money goes. And there was more money than they needed. The third assertion was disarmed due to the ascetic practices of believers in comparison to the hedonistic lifestyle of Rome. His main point is that they unjustly suffer and do so contrary to all law and reason. Thus, sovereigns like the emperors should remove all its causes. That's a good philosophical argument, that if we're better than them at this and they're not being damaged, we should not be damaged. It's a good legal stance. No, their accusation is coming up still. The accusation is that there was an individual, a very angry man from Athens, who became a politician. And he was the one who brought up Christians on charges, saying their slaves said this of them. No, he actually says it's same-sex encounters and deviant behavior with all ages. So that's not their projection. That's what they actually claimed. That's a tough thing to claim of Christians. Because Christians were known, even to the empire, Christians were known. Even Trajan, who was no friend of the Jews and no friend of Christians, saw their piety and said, unless they break the law, don't kill them. But catch them in a law. You can kill them, just catch them in a law. And Pliny was struggling trying to get him to say, just kill him, because he'd just as them have him dead than have him alive. And Trajan, the emperor, says, no, you've got to catch him first. And so, no, this is actual deviancy that they claimed. And this is hard because it was spread throughout all of Athens. Everybody in Athens said that about Christians. They eat babies, I mean, you only have to say it once. And that was a rumor also. And elsewhere about Christians, they ate babies. That one we can trace back. And it was traced back, it happened in Smyrna and Ephesus. And it was because of a part of a prayer that said, holy child of Jesus, eat his flesh and drink his blood, which wasn't about a literal, it was actually about the Eucharist, but the wording was ambiguous, and that caused people to say they were cannibals of little babies. It doesn't take much to twist these words if you hate the people. It doesn't take much to twist them. Again, how do you defend that if you're just a rank and file citizen of Athens and not a philosopher? How would you even address it without pointing out that you're one of those child eaters, right? Most of his arguments are grounded in logic rather than faith, which I liked a lot. This is the fourth time I read this document with a fine-tooth comb, and it's just a delight to see. He's not appealing to the God card. He's really going right to reason and to logic and logos theory, which is something he's going to introduce in a moment. For the Christian concept of God is purer than what the philosophers taught and what the Romans worshipped, he says. This was the same whether a believer was illiterate or educated, whether an old woman or a skilled worker, for everyone was able to apply this definition or understanding of God. Your philosophy is worthless if there's only a handful of people who understand it. Your science is worthless if there's only a handful of people who understand it. And in this culture, science ruled and philosophy was secondary to it. This is something we don't understand. Philosophy was the main branch of academia until just a couple of hundred years ago. For example, if you go to medical school, you do all your internship, you spend 12 years doing all this, you get a degree. What is your degree? It's a PhD, right? If you get your highest degree in academia, it's a PhD. The PhD is a philosophy degree. It's a doctorate of philosophy. That's a PhD. Every degree is a doctorate of philosophy, except a religious degree. And what happened was during this scholastic movement was people began to gather around certain Christian leaders who had rhetoric that they were teaching, or science, or grammar, or you name it. They all had these schools that they developed, and they needed sanctions because they had to have the approval of the church to have a school of rhetoric and a school of athletics and a school of these things beside those that were already practiced. And the church was concerned that they would develop a system that could negate their own presence. So they excluded from law and rhetoric and science, etc., the THD, which was the highest degree you could receive, and that's a church degree, doctorate of theology. Today, it's not even an academic degree. They're shunned. But in the ancient world, even 200 years ago, that was the apex of Christian endeavor academically, was to get your THD and teach as if you were a scholar, because that's a scholar's degree. Today, that's not the case. In fact, a person with a THD would never probably teach on a university system. And a person with a PhD would probably never teach on a seminary campus. They just don't see each other as, they see each other as rivals, not even having the same academic approach. For right or for wrong, it's a general statement, but that's what I've seen over and over and over again. So the THD is no longer sought. You go after a PhD. Again, a philosophy degree. So for centuries now, the philosophy degree was the highest sought. Philosophy was the art of science. Philosophy was the art of rhetoric. Philosophy was the sum total of all things pursued academically. And we've lost this. We've lost this. My favorite college professor for philosophy was unbelievably gifted. I took a class from him on the Epicureans and these early writers, and I want to take another one as well, and this was on Descartes and Locke and Hume and all all my faves of a more recent period. And every class he came in as if he were the subject of the day. Today we're doing David Hume. I'm David Hume. But he wouldn't tell you this. You had to guess who he was, what his argument was when he came in the classroom. You had to be extremely prepared. It was a ball. It was like a circus trying to figure out who he was. He was brilliant. He died of lung cancer. Not surprised. He was a chain smoker. He used to bum cigarettes off us. I used to carry cigarettes. Never smoked in my life. Carry them because it would give me a chance to talk to him while he's lighting up. Yeah, this is the same thing at Harvard. They smoke like crazy out there, and the only way to talk to them is them bumming cigarettes off of you. At least when I was there, that was the case. It was pretty funny. But he would don the garment practically. You could just see him cloaked in this character, and he wouldn't let you argue from anybody else's perspective, only from his perspective. Gosh, that was helpful to see it actually applied. I don't see people doing this any longer. Gosh, that was so brilliant to watch. Except when it came to John Locke. We all wondered. He came and said, I'm not doing John Locke, he's an idiot. He just wouldn't do him. He said, so we're going to do philosophy part 2 and do Plato over again. Take a different perspective. He just hated John Locke because he thought the arguments were just so lame. But his doing Spinoza was unbelievably brilliant. And Spinoza is the ground swell of all hermeneutic studies. I mean, this is a philosopher who developed the laws of interpretation. So all these characters, you know, they would have been equivalent in his day. And for him to be hobnobbing with them all the time and making sure that the principles that he's teaching are in sync with the schools as they develop was a lifetime ambition. He became a philosopher. While suspect, since they taught a new theology, Christians rejected ancient rites of Rome, and this led to reprisals and more rumors. However, refusing to perform divine honors to the emperor, well, that resulted in treason and death. Beginning with Nero, you were a divine individual the moment you declared it so. Claudius refused it. Caligula certainly took it. Augustus wouldn't take it. He didn't even want it after death for him to become a god. Honorable individual he was. But after Nero, after 60 or so, 68 especially, every character in the empire was declared a god. And you see that because of all the coins. All the spiky pins are off of his head. That's the radiant God, the announced, proclaimed God. And if you don't pay tribute to that God by giving an offering during your call, it's your turn to do so, it'll lead to death. Not prison. Imprisonment is death. You're denying the gods of the state, hence damaging the empire.
Was that when you had to declare that, as a Christian, that the emperor was Lord, not Jesus? That's part of that?
Yep. And you got a certificate. You got a certificate of proof that you burned an offering for him. If you don't have papers, you get arrested. No trial. Straight to the animals. As problematic was their rejection of the games of the arena because this was a cultural thing. It'd be like, we don't have that much culture any longer in California. It's so blended. But having a culture that defines you as a people in a modern world and not doing it would make you look like you're not a good neighbor, make you look like you're standoffish, make you look like you don't care about the culture and the heritage of our people. It'd be like the only person in the block not celebrating Halloween or Christmas. And they're so well marketed that not doing it does make you feel a little out of sorts. The difference is describing the stadium deaths of gladiators and others, which, by the way, was less often than you think. It's not quite like this, but we put, $2 million is what I heard or read, $2 million into every fighter we have in a jet, because the jet's like $2 billion. We spend $2 million training them. We're not going to want them to die. We're not going to send them in a place where they can get hit. You don't kill your gladiators. You keep them alive. They train, they spar, they're all friends, they don't want to die. And if you fight well, you don't die. It's if you make a mistake, you die. And even then they had to turn to the owner because these are all owned people. They're not free. Despite what you've been told, these are slaves. We found their menu. We found the the names of the gladiators, especially the main headliners, and how long they lived. They don't live long. They live big, but they don't live long. This idea that they could walk and remit sentences, nothing like that's true. Nothing like that's true. But they're big, they're superstars of sports. No one knows the rough life they live. They're sparring all day long. They're salving their wounds from the previous time. And it's all fair. It's just difficult to see one of your fallen heroes and everybody looks at his owner, he's fallen. Can we kill him? And he has to give the approval, because he's the one who put the money in, has to give approval to have him killed. That's rough. So it's not what we think. It's not about the bloodshed. It's about a good sport. And these heroes have to come back to keep celebrating their victories. They're not all going to die. So despite every movie you've seen about gladiators, as if they're free people and like all that glamour and glitz of the popularity, that's not the case at all. That's not Athens. That's not Rome. That's not any place. You don't kill your heroes. But they die. They die because they make a mistake. So Christians look very countercultural. You can see that to this day. Look at the 250, 300 years ago when people were flocking to America from overseas, England and elsewhere. If you didn't practice the same religious rites, you were left outside in the cold. We had the same thing here. It just seems antisocial not to have Christmas in a certain way, and yet the Pilgrims and the Puritans shunned Christmas as a festival, called it pagan. They did the same with Easter. They called it pagan. In fact, the third line for reasons wanting this charter to leave of the Pilgrims was because they celebrate now two pagan festivals, Christmas and Easter. So it would seem antisocial. Christians looked antisocial. They didn't practice in the debauchery. They didn't go out drinking. They didn't go out raping. They didn't go out to the whorehouses, which were every corner practically in Athens. They didn't do that. Therefore, they looked like they didn't fit in. So we counterbalance this with multiple references from classical pagan literature. Part of his proof that in the style that he uses, this great learning gets in the way of his vocabulary. How do you communicate these lofty ideas to the masses? And this is something that's been read out loud. He wants to make sure the emphasis is properly placed. So I think he's having a difficult time dumbing it down, just as much as we're having a difficult time trying to figure out what he's saying. Pretty lofty stuff. The apology ends with the plea for the emperor or the magistrate to judge fairly, because it's only to their advantage. We are good citizens. We do the right things. We help the homeless. We take care of the widows and orphans. Otherwise, you'd be doing it. Since believers lead peaceful and quiet lives and pray for the government that it may increase, be just and keep the peace. That's all Christians were about, keeping the peace, being just, and living quiet, peaceful lives. Athenagoras represents a small segment of the faith, clearly, one that exploited the most prestigious elements of Greek culture, and in that regard, he was especially brilliant. He knew it because he lived it. His whole life, he lived it. In fact, the core of his argument is that there is no fundamental conflict between the church and the state, and that believers actually help secure stability in the empire. Only the ignorant and the prejudiced, he says, could regard Christianity as anything like immoral or atheistic. Interestingly enough, that's exactly what Socrates was called, atheistic and immoral. Welcome, Barbara. I don't know how far we're going to get into this and have time, because I want to delve into a chapter that I translated for tonight. But if you look this over real quickly, you can see that he deals with Greece and Rome, and not one of them is free from the conviction that Christians are being labeled. Everything that you see them approaching Christians and using to kill them could be found in all their gods, all their heroes, even their legislators. So the plea is his apology. It's absolutely brilliant. I didn't reproduce it because it's easy to get access to, But I did write a good summary, I think, of what he's trying to accomplish, and I think it's the finest from this era we have in defense of Christianity. I do see also this last line, the tagline I wrote here, because I was in a sour mood, that modern scholars, unfortunately, have lost this. We're afraid of using science, we're afraid of using rhetoric, we're afraid of using grammar and the history of our own culture, or even the history of another culture. We're afraid of that. Or is it that we're ignorant and don't know how? We've lost all rhetoric in our culture. Rhetoric is gone. And when you do hear it, the cadence and the genius of the style just supersedes anything else you've ever heard. Rhetoric used to be taught in school. It's how to deliver something effectively, how to keep the cadence in your voice, how to be persuasive without being overbearing. Rhetoric was taught like math. It was just as important, and we've lost it. Rhetoric is totally out of our jurisdiction any longer in schools. We don't have any control over what people say, how they say it. We have to look at their style, but if the style is poor, we just have to mark it. We can't say, go to rhetoric school. There's no rhetoric school left. It's all gone. And yet 100 years ago, 120 years ago, if you entered a university, rhetoric was almost the first thing you took. You read the classics and you learned rhetoric. If you're going to represent our school, you will speak properly. So speaking properly and getting your degree were hand in hand. We've lost that. Being killed for it, that would be a bad sign. Okay. This is chapter 31. Of course, the chapters are all randomly put together by theme, but I translated this. It took the better part of a week. I had to go back to it again and again and again because it's not easy Greek. It's classical Greek, updated but classical Greek, and I was trained in Koine Greek, so I'm struggling to get the right terminology. Lexicons were helpful. But I think I got the basic gist of it down. And I want to take a break every sentence and get your input, all right? They have contrived further stories against us of impious feasts and forbidden sexual relations between the genders, both so that they may appear to have rational grounds for hatred. And since they think by fear, they hope either to make us stumble from our way of life or to render the rulers cruel and inevitable by the magnitude of the charges they levy. That's a brilliant sentence. Just a long one, but a brilliant sentence. That's rhetoric. Charming, articulate rhetoric. So let's go back and look at it. Impious feasts. Now, why would Christians be accused of impious feasts? Those of you who read the Didache. Why would Christians be accused of impious feasts? They certainly have a feast, don't they? They have a feast every week. Justin described it. The Didache describes it. The book of Acts describes it. Body and blood, sacred meal. Only those who have been initiated can participate. This looks like a mystery cult. I'm not saying it is, but there's a reason it looks like a mystery cult, because it's designed to attract those who are seeking a more intimate relationship with God. It would make it impious because they're not a registered mystery cult, you see. You can worship any god you want, just get the right papers for it. And Mithraism, we know that more than almost more than any other mystery cult, and it was so similar to Christianity at times, stunningly so, because the same thing that works in one group is going to work in another. And we've lost this. A few years ago, many years ago, 30 I guess now, how long ago was, I can't even think of the name of the presentation any longer. It was after Est, but it was, I can't remember what it was called now. Darn it. But it was a very popular movement, and I was asked to go in there because a friend of mine was being initiated, and I thought, how interesting this will be. They just took the popular, unskilled, unresearched understanding of what these mystery cults were and developed their own, and they led these people in with blindfolds on, and they opened their eyes, and the person that's there, this is the person that's going to guide you and help you. That's a mystery cult all over. It's just very poorly done. You see these all the time. Mystery cults emerging, and they don't have the bite to them because they're not countercultural enough. This made Christians look much like them, except because it's not accepted, because it's not embraced as part of their pantheon. There's not a God that's in their pantheon that they can draw from as legitimacy. Yeah, they look like they're antisocial and that they're doing things behind doors and yet you look at the Didache, you look at these other works like Justin, it's open to the public. You can go in, you can eat, but you just can't participate in the Eucharist because that was something only baptized people knew. But their doors were open to everybody, and Christians kept saying that. We're not hiding anything. Anything that we do is available to all people at all times, and that's not what a mystery cult was at all. In fact, in all honesty, we really don't know what any of the mystery cults were doing. They were mystery cults. You swear an oath not to convey them. And even though people say we found remnants of a book that they wrote, but not their secrets. Once a year, all the mystery cults got together and walked down the main streets of Rome. They were all sanctioned to try to draw. It's like a sorority or a fraternity trying to get new members, trying to get people to apply. And they were successful at doing so, but every trade had a mystery cult attached to it. Every trade had an association cult. So if you were a weaver or if you were a farmer, you had certain gods that were attributed to that field or that profession, and then you'd have the mystery cults that would follow it. Christians were accused of this, but they did their stuff openly. They're not hiding it. Even when Pliny the Younger writes Trajan the Emperor and says in the year 110, well, I have Christians in my neighborhood. Can I kill them? Can I kill them? And Trajan writes back, what'd they do? Before you kill them, what'd they do? Well, they meet at a certain hour. They have a prayer to their God. They worship Christ as if he were a God. They swear they're going to keep their oaths. They're never going to sin in public. Now can I kill them? They're still not getting it. It's because they're not a registered cult, not because of what they're doing. And Christians refuse to be registered among the pagan cults of Rome, which is enough to get you killed, which they did. So what a rough place to be, having all the right answers but not belonging to the right club. What a terrible place to be, and that's what happens to Christianity during this period. They do this because, the sexual relations between genders is a real tough word to translate. It's not necessarily same gender, but it's multiple gender, whatever that would mean. I had a hard time trying to find the right words for it. On these rational grounds for hatred, they called it. Stumble from the path of life, that's chapter 1, verse 1 of the Didache. Again, taking a step from the wrong path to the right path and vice versa. Inevitably, because the rulers are going to get more cruel, the magnitude of the levies of the charges that they levy is like the more you're persecuted, the more you're proven to be guilty. And therefore, it's going to be harder and harder to shake that because you're always going to be more guilty than you were the last time someone was accused of it. It's a cycle you can't break. However, their efforts are lost with those who know that from antiquity it has been the custom, thus not only in our time, for vice to conduct war with virtue or against virtue. So he quotes a very popular classical phrase. Again, this is Athenagoras. So you know what it's like. Virtue always loses when vice is involved. So you can claim to be virtuous, but proclaim to be virtuous only makes you hidden vice. You can't win that argument. It's circular. And how do I know you're practicing vice? Because you're doing it in private. But we're telling it's open, but no one's going. It's vice. I mean, that's just so bizarre, a circuit argument, but one that was popular. And Athenagoras comes back with this remarkable statement. He says, consequently, Pythagoras, with 300 others, was burnt to death. Heraclitus and Democritus were banished, one from the city of Ephesus, the other from the city of Abdera, which is in Thrace, because he was charged with being a lunatic. And the Athenians condemned Socrates to death. So anybody you throw our way, you kill them too. The greatest minds of the day you murdered for the same reasons, because they formed around, like Pythagoras did. Pythagoras formed around his movement a religious experience. It was a scientific movement that bred this numbers are magical, numbers are, they convey ideas that no other sect or cult would. And here's the reason why. At the time of Pythagoras and all of his theorems and all of his mathematics and the rigors of his system, at that time there were no integers. Everything was done mentally. That should make your mind go, poof. Because without integers, how would you prove it? It was all proved in the head. It'd be mental exercises between two mathematicians to determine how the answer to this reasonable question was found. Brilliant. That's what made it so astounding. And we've lost this. We've lost the genius of math. It's not surprising that you find the head of the School of Divinity a mathematician. It's all over. It's all the time, especially 100 years ago. All my heroes were mathematicians or patristic scholars, because to get your degree in math meant you were well-versed in every science. And we've lost this in the West, especially in the United States. We've lost this. It used to be the highest position. Well, we see this in people like Polkinghorne and Lennox, these brilliant mathematicians and physicists who leave their profession after 25 years to become clergymen. You see that. They want to combine them. And they're doing a good job. If you've not seen that, go to YouTube and look at their videos. They're very, very impressive. Physics and mathematics, one Cambridge, one Oxford, they're getting along perfectly fine, but they're debating people like Dawkins and others very effectively so. All these academics are now joining the church in their effort to try to look like we have some classical training behind us. In England, it's not as difficult as it is in the States. So look, they killed Heraclitus, the genius himself, Pythagoras, Democritus, even Socrates. And even so, they were none the worse in respect of virtue because of the opinion of the populace. The opinion of the populace always wins. No matter what you claim, the thuggery wins. Socrates, if you remember his story, Socrates is facing 70 leaders, the new echelon of power in Athens. They're all friends of his. Some of them were former students of his. But now, with the pressures of a declining Athens and the emergence of independent philosophers like Socrates, Socrates has to defend his life, which is where we get the word apology, has to defend his life before people he knows are going to kill him anyway. He knows his conclusion before he starts, which is why he mocks them. He'll say, I hope when I'm dead, because I know you'll kill me, I hope when I'm dead that you treat my sons just as meanly as you did me. Because then I have a legacy of showing that ignorant people kill bright people. It's just brilliant. He just finds this way of mocking and pushing buttons and getting under their skin, and they finally do condemn him to death. Well, he had a choice. He could leave. He could leave. But he didn't. He said, no, he didn't say it, but you can get this impression that my death will speak louder than my life, which it did. We're still talking about him 2,500 years later. And early Christians called him a pre-Christian anyway, so he ended up even being a Christian, even though Christianity didn't exist yet. That's a lot to put on somebody, and Socrates was able to do it. I have tremendous respect for this guy. I don't like his habits. He never bathed, never washed his feet, never combed his hair. He looked like a scruffy philosopher. But what a genius. And it's hard, as you know, those of you who read Plato, to determine where Plato ends and where Socrates begins. But my heavens, it's brilliant to see somebody so enamored with a scholar to put him in such positive light. And he was a man of few words. He formed a school, but he was a man of few words, wanting his students to speak so that he could correct them rather than depend on rhetoric and not content. So he was a man of content and a man of rhetoric. I have tremendous respect for him. But yeah, you killed him too. You Athenians killed Socrates. Undiscriminating libel with which some men cast shadow upon us with regard to morality of life, since with God we stand in good repute. We don't care if you don't like us. We're pure before God. Now that's as good an argument as anybody can make. I'm good with God. If you're going to convict me, prove by giving me evidence. Give me evidence. The evidence is rumor. Rumor isn't evidence. Give me some more evidence. And Athenagoras kept asking for evidence, and none could be provided. Nevertheless, I will address these charges as well, although I am fully persuaded that by what has been said already, you have cleared me. That sounds just like Socrates. I'm going to clear everybody I can, and I'm sure I'm out of the loop on this one. It's so clever. Very Socratic of him. All right. This is the page I want to spend some time on. Even though you exceed all men in intelligence. That's a good opening line. You Athenians, unlike anybody else in the world when it comes to intelligence. You know that those who live are directed towards God as a rule. If you look at science, you can look at God. That's his argument. You can look at science and say what we know about spatial diagrams, we know about math, we know about the nebulous of astronomy, we knew about scientific experiments that they were conducting, but they knew the world pretty well. This is a this is post those eras where everything in Aristotle was done by testing, and testing with raw data that was often in error. And the chief cause of all this in Athenagoras is the logos. The logos is that which generates life, promotes justice, creates the world, and personified in Christ. Again, the logos doctrine, like John chapter 1, is used to defend Christians against misunderstanding. Logos was used among the Stoics. That's where he gets it. Logos and reason were equivalent terms in the Stoics. And since he was a former Stoic and argues with others around. And by the way, you should know the whole document is really temperate. It's very soft-spoken because it's addressed to Marcus Aurelius, whose whole premise was keep quiet, slow down, remain silent, let your wisdom speak louder than your mouth. So the temperate feel of this reflects the audience, which is Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. So that each one among us may be blameless and irreproachable before God, before him. Do not even consider the slightest thought of sin. How can that be true? How can you actually make the claim that you never have a single thought, even the slightest inkling of sin? What is sin? Yes, please. You do get this impression twice over in the Didache. I remember the first time reading the Didache, I thought, wow, how relieving, how relieving, how relieving, until that one line where it says, if you can bear the whole yoke of everything that's been said, you'll be complete in God. The next line was, but if you can't, that which you are able, that you should do. We forgot that sin isn't an act, it's a condition. And the only things that can make sin an indictment is apostasy, for sure. Adultery, for sure, because you violated the family code of ethics. And the third, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question. What is apostasy in this case?
Apostasy would be denying the faith and without return. They're going to deny the faith, walk away from it. This is why Paul would say, how can you do that? You have experienced everything enriched in Christ, and you're walking from it because of persecution. They walked away from it because of persecution. Look at what happened in Carthage when persecution first broke out there. It was so tragic. Hundreds of people died, but most of the church apostatized. And a big debate opened after the persecution ceased. It opened, what do we do with these Christians now that want back? Do we allow them back in? If so, do they have to be rebaptized? I mean, that's how serious it was. They apostatized. Are they allowed back in? Even though they apostatized to save their life, there are lots of martyrs who didn't do it. And there were debates between whether they can come back at all. Furthermore, go back to the teaching, the Didache again. It describes in one of his chapters a whole list of vices. Those are vices. Are they sins? They're vices, but are they sins? Murder certainly would be one of those sins. And that would include abortion in the womb, out of the womb. That would be cold-blooded. That would be during war. That would be gladiatorial, all those things. These are certain sins that are irrevocable.
So does murder just pertain to murder one another, like anyone?
Again, that's hard to say. Murder is murder. I know that doesn't sound all that profound. But if a baby in the womb is protected, why wouldn't an animal in the field be protected that isn't? I mean, if it's for sport, maybe so. I mean, you eat lamb, you have to kill it to eat it. You eat chicken, you have to kill it to eat it. Unless you become vegan, and the early church wasn't vegan by any means. Not that I'm opposed to it, it just wasn't even something they consider. Except right, exactly. Right, exactly. What do you do with the cannibalism that, awaits us all in this document? I'm going back to your comment. Let me see if I believe that. Is this Ray Brown?
No, it was
Okay. Because I don't remember this in anything he wrote. Let me think this through. If there are 3 cardinal sins, we'll call it what we want. There's going to be multiple sins that list underneath. Let's look at the first one. Let's look at apostasy. What would define apostasy? Leaving what? Or giving religion up altogether. Why would that be a cardinal sin? Well, for the same reason sin against the Holy Spirit is. If you're denying that which brings you redemption and purity, then there's no redemption or purity for you. If you deny the God that you used to serve, who gave you eternal life, etc., you're denying that. You have cut off ties to the benefits that you gave up. What do you do, though, with verses from Paul that says, whether you like it or not, in one man everyone dies, and one man everyone resurrects again? And Paul saying that the Jews, because they have a covenant, they're in whether they like it or not. Those aren't at all consistent with this one principle in the way that we define it. So it seems to have to have substructure to it. Did he ever provide like secondary, tertiary? There'd have to be, because apostasy certainly would be something that's unforgivable, because if you no longer have the means of forgiveness because you denied it, you no longer can get forgiveness, right? If you're married and you have an affair and you then kick out your wife of the house or your husband of the house, there's no chance to reconcile, right? That's just the way it is. Is that how low this goes? Or do you have to remain faithful to God without cheating on him at all? That would mean what? Not liking other philosophies? Not sharing in some of the ideals and morality of the Hellenistic world? And what do we do with the jump between then and now? What is sin? If we're supposed to stop sinning, what is sin? Why haven't we ever answered this question? Not just here, anywhere. What is sin? Besides that which my pastor doesn't like. You know, my pastor was opposed to rock and roll. I think I heard 1,000 sermons on rock and roll. Today it's rap music, but it was rock and roll. Before that, it was something else. They always have something they're opposed to, and they preach on it like crazy. I don't remember that in the New Testament, but I do remember it as a product of my youth. What would be an unforgivable sin? How do you apostatize? I don't know what it would take to make me apostatize.
Well, there is an unforgivable sin in the New Testament,
Right.
which is the sin against the Holy Spirit,
Right.
which is undefined.
It is. I think it's kind of implied, though. If God is the means of your creation and your demise, and if Christ is the Redeemer sent to make eternal life your objective, then the Holy Spirit is that which indwells us to make that happen. If you deny the Holy Spirit its presence, then everything else in the chain breaks. I think that's why the Trinity is so misunderstood as well. The Trinity is, God can't be incarnate and carnate at the same time. He couldn't be of two natures. And the Holy Spirit is definitely non-physical, non-tangible, and yet real. And Christ is certainly incarnate. And the Father has to be beyond the dimension where that takes place. You need all three just to have Christianity survive. Christ becomes the necessary link between that which you cannot attain and that which is inevitable, which is death. He overcomes it with resurrection. The number one reason for writing this, he says, is because of the resurrection. In fact, the next document in the paper is on his treatise on the resurrection, and he has brilliant scientific documentation about the resurrection, because he says he has an argument from science that immortality is in our system. We all teach about immortality. It's all in our culture. If you don't have it in the culture, you can't find it in the universe, blah, blah, blah. And it's just brilliantly arranged in a unique way that I only find in this particular writer. But back to sin again. So the unforgivable sin is inevitable. If you are denying that which brings you life immortal, then you're denying the God that provides it. That would make sense to me. It also what led, unfortunately, to the way the Trinity was seen. The relationship is there, but the way we have limited that relationship, I think, is just way off the chart. When I look at the Nicene Creed, I just cringe. I think it didn't go anywhere near as far as it should have with regard to the scientific evidence behind the nature of God, which is what he's all about. Let's continue. Anybody else want to comment on that?
We were just wondering how these 7 cardinal sins, pride and all the others, fit in there. To me, they seem clearer than talking about murder, adultery, and apostasy as being the 3 great sins, because these are real conditions. I mean, pride, egotism, hubris, arrogance as the primary sin that all others fall from.
Why do you look at me so intently when you say these sins? I think, yeah. Well, let's show the problems with it. What is murder? Can you kill a cow for food? Is that okay? Does a cow not have a consciousness? Are we supposed to eat only blades of grass? Oh, by the way, blades of grass have a kind of consciousness to them. They know when you're cutting them. So we cannot eat grass?
As the Chardonnay says, is it murder if I kill a man trying to get into my cave to get my food in the time of famine?
Is it murder to help a man take his life if he's in torture and murder the way he feels all day long? Is that murder? I don't know if there's an ethical answer, but it would seem to me more ambiguous than killing a cow for eating. I mean, ironically, how can you say killing a cow is bad if you don't kill the cow, you don't have any vellum, you have no Bible, so there you go. You couldn't write it down anyway. It just baffles me. What defines murder? What defines adultery? Adultery is a little easier. Anything outside of marriage, even a glance, as Jesus describes, is adultery in the heart, but it's not adultery in the action. You can avoid it in the heart. Look at the story of Abel for a moment. Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and God approaches him and says, before he kills his brother, he says, this anger of yours, sin is knocking on the door, but you can overcome it. Sin is knocking on the door. It seems to me that all sin, everyone is able to overcome. So why don't we? Is it because sin is more fun? It seems to me that sin and the cover-up of sin wouldn't be terribly fun over time. Integrity would seem to be more fun, ultimately, because you have that to fall back on. I need some help here. What sins are too vile to be forgiven? Please.
I was just going to say that murdering a cow is sort of questionable, but adultery with a cow,
Definitely less ambiguous. Definitely less ambiguous.
If you molest my child, I'm not sure I would forgive you.
I'm sure I wouldn't. I'm sure I wouldn't. Does that make me a bad person? It makes me a very protective parent who now feels guilty because he trusted someone he shouldn't have. You
Aren't we working on defining something that is universal?
It would seem to me that if it were a sin, it would have to be accepted universally in every culture. That makes it more difficult.
Yeah, it does.
And that's why I think we have a do and don't list, and it's real in error when it comes to Christianity, because Christianity was a universal religion. And it's going to be interpreted differently in India than it will be in Babylonia, than it will be in Greece, than it will be in Rome, or the New World, ultimately. Yes, I think we have gone too far on what sin is.
So it almost could be that there is no such thing as sin because it's not universally.
There's no way to define sin that would necessitate every culture or allow every culture to understand it the same way. Right? Don't know. Yeah.
If the Ten Commandments are universal, then that would be the definition of falsehood. Breaking the commandment.
Which version of the Ten Commandments? Chapter 34 or chapter 20?
In general, we could all understand that there's principles.
Okay, again, you're right. But what is murder then? What is theft? I mean, how far do we have to parse this? This is why James did it best, without a doubt. James did it best. James says there's only one commandment, the royal commandment, the royal law. Love one another as you want to be loved. But that's hard to define too. What if I don't feel terribly lovely today? Or loving today? Stay away from everybody. Look in a mirror and say, it's you, it's you, it's you. Bob?
sort of boils down to harm, either physical or spiritual,
That's certainly what the rabbi said.
against others or against yourself. Obviously, others being more serious for yourself, violating God's intent for yourself.
That's a wise approach. Harm certainly was what rabbi said, because every sin of harm had multiple listings of things you had to give back. Damage from this and damage from that. So if it's harm, how do you define harm? Is it willful neglect? Yeah. Are you really in control of your sin? These are questions they were asking back then. We're not even asking these questions. Can you control your sin? I mean, if you have a sin nature, as we've determined was an early Christian, then you can't control your sin. That's why I say we can control our sin, because sin nature didn't exist at the time of Athenagoras. Bob?
I'm very skeptical of the idea of not doing something to be a sinner.
A sin of omission, you mean? Yeah. I'm somewhat skeptical of that because it could be any number of things. endless numbers of things. Endless. Right. Yeah, and that's sins of omission are just as guilt-packed as sins of, yeah.
I'm also just, thinking of problems we have sometimes with translations, and I think specifically of this word that in the Greek we translate sometimes as murder, sometimes as kill. And, we speakers of English are determining which meaning is implied in that original, and that gets to be very touchy when I think of, if I go and kill someone because I don't like him, what if I'm in an army and I drop a nuclear bomb on someone because everyone says those are bad people, we should drop a nuclear bomb on them, and these kinds of questions get to be very...
Yeah, on a global scale it's far more difficult too because there's too many variables. But on a personal level, do you really know you're sinning? If you know you're sinning, it's sin. But how much of what you think is sin is really the preaching of a pulpit?
I mean, how much do we just do whatever our culture, our society tells us to do?
Regardless of whether it's sinful. That's right.
If I become more conscious or develop a higher consciousness than the average in my society, well, I'll probably get,
And yet, Athenagoras says that very thing. He said, this is the first earth that we're living on. This is it. But we're moving on in resurrection to the next world. That's the prayer of all Christians. We move on to the next world. In the next world, we won't have these same challenges. We'll have different challenges. And I think that's the point you're trying to drive here, that if sin is physical and encompassing our existence here, the next world, that'll all be resolved.
I think maybe that's what I'm thinking. Maybe there's an evolution of consciousness.
That's exactly the word he uses, evolution. He says, as science has shown, evolution of things take place. It doesn't know the universe, of course. This is a personal journey. It's your sin versus God's understanding of it and your understanding of God. If this were the case, and I have a leaning towards it, then it's just me and God and not me and anybody else. Sin is defined on a relationship I have with God and the effect it has on me because of it. But that makes it so personal you can't apply it across the table.
If I inadvertently hurt someone, that's a sin.
Why? Inadvertently.
Why?
If it's inadvertently, why would it be a sin? That's my argument.
Because I hurt the other.
Yeah, but you didn't mean to.
I didn't mean to.
Then it's not a sin.
Okay, well, and I apologize.
Right.
Because it happened to be before.
But that's what we've done to sin. We've made sin things for which we're sorry. But at the time, would you have done it if you knew you were going to feel sorry? No, necessarily. So it's not sin. And I think, Ed, what you were saying, these three sins, I think it needs to be boiled down to something like this so we stop thinking every single time we open our mouth we're sinning. Is it a sin for me to be angry because someone cut me off the freeway? No. Is it wrong for me to take something and throw it at his car? Probably. Is it a sin? Don't know. At what point does it become a sin? When he's damaged? When I'm no longer reflecting the Christ within me? Boy, that's tough too. Because your knowledge of Christ would then reflect a state different than everybody else around you. It's not easy. And we haven't solved it in 2,500 years. Because it began with the arguments coming from Socrates and Plato. Well, you certainly couldn't kill yourself and then forgive yourself. That would be remarkable. Let's see, if it's about forgiveness, that's certainly recovery, that's certainly atonement. Is sin tied to atonement? It is consequentially. I don't know. I just don't know how to define sin in a way that allows people of all ethnicities, cultures, time, to be evaluated as such. Look at the story of Noah, for all of its flaws. He was a preacher of righteousness. You had a choice, and they mocked him. But you only get one choice here. Adam and Eve the same way, only one choice. Abraham, only one choice. Well, he's trying to address it. He's trying to address it by looking at sin as defined in the church compared to sin as defined by the Romans. And he wants to make sure that cultural sin or inadequacy does not impact Christian life. But he says it doesn't even say it casually. He says it in passing, we would never sin. We don't sin. And early Christians all maintain that once you are baptized, you never sin again. And every writer, without exception, makes that assertion. So something had to have been taught, Ed, that isn't a list this long of what sins are, because there shouldn't be a grocery list of sin potential. There has to be something else that defines sin.
Well, one of the reasons why there in the Catholic Church, one of the reasons why there is such a long list is because in the early Middle Ages, in the Irish Church, people would go to confession and they would confess things to the priest. The priest, there was not a high standard of education.
Right.
Priests would not necessarily know what to say to the parishioners, to the sinner, and so somebody came up with the idea of developing a list of sins, of things that were sinful, and so they came up with this tremendously long list
Right.
of all kinds of things that were wrong, and that the priest could then say, well, did you,
Right.
did you, and the person would say, well, yes. How many times? No. And they go on to the next one.
Boy, that's a long series if you got a big parish.
There was on KPDH, when it was still KPDH, years ago, on Saturday night was British Comedy Night.
Right.
And there used to be this Anglo-Irish comedian, whose name I can't remember, who was always making jokes about the Catholic Church. And
Always missing a finger, remember? His ring finger was missing. Always drank scotch. Yeah. David Allen. Love the show. He's absolutely brilliant.
one of his jokes was about these two Irishmen who go into church. One of them tells the other that he's going to go to confession, and he's going to go to Father so-and-so, and the other Irishman says, well, tell me, if it was easy on you or hard or whatever. And so the Irishman goes in and says, Father, I committed adultery
Wow.
a number of times. My last big confession was such and such a day. I committed adultery so many times. And the priest says, well, was it with Mrs. So-and-so? No. Was it with Mrs. So-and-so? No. Was it with Mrs. So-and-so? No. And so then he's absolved and goes out of the confessional and he talks to his friend, and the friend asks, well, was he rough on you? And he says, no, and I got three good things.
That's David Allen all over. My favorite David Allen, we got to get back. My favorite David Allen joke, very similar in his approach, because he's a very funny man. His stuff's out on DVD. I don't have it yet, but I will eventually get it. It's brilliant. He said, Peter is up in heaven looking over the clouds to earth below, and he sees one of his favorite priests out playing golf on the Sabbath. He says, God, he's playing golf on the Sabbath. Are you going to punish him? He says, I'll punish him. Hang on. Takes a swing, gets a hole in one. Takes the ball, puts it back, swings another hole in one. And Peter gets mad and says, I thought you said you're going to punish him. I just did. Who can he tell? Who can he tell? Nothing would be worse for a golfer to get 3 hole-in-ones and not be able to tell someone doing it on the Sabbath is the bad part. Brilliant, yeah. And he knew how to do it. He knew how to tell the story. And he knew what sin was because of what his raising in the church. And this is the problem. I think we haven't done a good job of recognizing the origin of our lists of sin, our list of vices. Paul has lists of vice lists. The Didache has a vice list. It's not hard to look at them, but they're vice lists, not necessarily lists that will send you to hell by our standard. Let's finish this up because we're going to run over otherwise. If we believe that we live only the present life, then we might be suspected of sinning, since we are enslaved to flesh and blood and are consumed with gain and carnal desire. But since we know that God is witness to what we think and what we say, both by night and by day, and that he, being light, sees all things on our heart, we are persuaded that when we are removed from the present life, there will be another, one better than the present, one heavenly, not earthly, since we will abide near God, this is all one sentence, and with God, free from change of suffering in the soul, as not as the flesh, even though we have flesh, but in the spirit heavens, or falling with the rest, a worse one, in fire, for God has not made us as sheep or beasts of burden, a mere addition to labor, but we should perish and be annihilated. That was the bottom line. Bottom line is this. We're flesh and blood. God did not make us to die. He made us to live forever. He didn't make us like something you can pass by and say, I'm more valuable or not valuable. Our world to come is a different one than it is now. But for those who don't embrace the gospel, all that awaits you is annihilation. The flame of annihilation. And the flame used here is the flame that consumes. I believe the Greek word, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is hasta la bye-bye. It's gone, just gone. You can see why it was so hard to translate. There are a lot of phrases in between phrases, wrapped within phrases. But brilliant, absolutely brilliant. On these grounds, it is not likely that we would wish to do evil or deliver one another over to the great judge, heavenly judge, to be punished. Wow. Why do we talk like this? Why don't our preachers preach like this? Why does everything have to be so convoluted all the time? Why does everything have to be either very popular, as if it's pablum, or it's valueless, or it's secondary? I don't get it. These are the arguments we should be having in seminaries. These are the arguments we should be having in every church, because it brings people together when they all realize sin is not defined. Yeah. He dies on behalf of your life. This is another argument he has, that Jesus is the Logos, he's eternal, and therefore he represents the eternality of God. Jesus dying, he says, for your sin is required only if he is incarnate, because no man could do it. Hence, Jesus is God's Son, he says, the incarnate one sent to redeem humanity. I think that's a pretty good argument, that Jesus has to be incarnate because he has to be flesh to experience what sin is in the world, and also be a spirit in order to relieve man from it. That makes good sense to me. It's good law. That's a good Stoic argument. So he would say sin is not necessary to determine God's willfulness to forgiveness, but forgiveness is waiting for those who aren't pure. Who's pure? None of us are pure. We all need redemption, which is a pretty good argument. And I think we've lost the rhetoric of this. It's well rhythmed. You get it. I would urge you, if you're going to get a copy of it, just go to newadvent.com, the Catholic site, and look under Church Fathers. All the Church Fathers are there for the first 500 years now. And they're good English translations. Old. They're 120 years old, some of them. But you get the gist of it. His argument is there. It's brilliant. His treatise on the resurrection is the best I've ever read. This is like the 8th time I've read that. Very clever, very scientific, which is what I like about him. Blends the modern science with the theology. Okay, any other questions on this before we part for the evening? We're leaving the subject behind and moving on to the heretics now. 4 weeks of heretics. Docetism, Marcion, you want to go to these. They're absolutely interesting as can be. I'll have some struggles with some of these as well because I get so enthralled in it that it's hard for me to pull out. But I think we talk about the Docetists next week. Is that right? I think it's a Docetist next week. That's the grandfather of all heresies, Christian heresies. Yes, Docetism. That makes sense. We'll bring in some examples as well, like the Gospel of Peter is a docetic work. We'll bring some of that in. This is the group that said Jesus did not have flesh. He was a spiritual entity. Okay, see you then.